So let me mention a couple other announcements here as we get started. Some things about the homework, and then I'll see if you guys have any questions about the homework. Number one, I have been very lenient in not taking off points for this in the future, or in the past, but that will change in the future. Several of you, well actually many of you, / the majority of you, have gotten pretty sloppy about your right statements, and I saw a lot of things like this. For records deleted, where there's a whole river of unnecessary white space right here because you didn't properly format the numbers on the output, okay? We need to make sure that we're not doing stuff like this. I saw that in the majority of the homework assignments where people weren't properly using the tools associated with the right statement to ensure that their output looked as it should. Yes, sir?
Is it possible that we could maybe get some sort of document to tell us what's the correct command usage for certain variables in the right statement to properly format it? Because that's a system variable that we get a call to record, and I don't think I remember or...
That was like the very first day of class where you use the parentheses star. You'll find that in like our very first set of PowerPoint slides. In front of it. You put that in front of any variable you want to output, and that will inhibit extraneous white space. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. Second thing is, we talked about this, but I think there's still some question on the part of many people. SY DB count and SY-SUBRC are set after every open SQL statement. Therefore, if you have a chain of 4 open SQL statements, and then you check those values after the 4th, all you're getting is the result from the 4th one. So the rule of thumb is you want to be checking perhaps SY-SUBRC or perhaps SYDB count after every time you have an open SQL statement. And so I saw a lot of people that were checking it in places, but not in all of the places, and therefore you're not really getting the test encompassing what it is that I think that you were. And then the last thing I'll comment is, I expected to get questions from students before the assignment was due based on your having tested your program and discovered something. In fact, I got no emails from any student about this, which led me to believe that people weren't thoroughly testing their programs. You need to make sure you test your programs with all possible scenarios. For this homework assignment that I just gave you, if in program number 2 you used an internal table to do your, let me back up. For program 1, if you used an internal table to do your insertion into the database, and your insertion resulted in a duplicate record, your program threw an exception and crashed. That's a behavior associated with using an internal table. Now, some of you did an insert of individual records and checked SY-SUBRC, and so you would not have caught that, and so perhaps you did in fact test your program. But really every program I saw that used an internal table in program number 1 crashed when I ran it, if I ran it 2 times in a row. That shouldn't happen, and so I was really surprised that I didn't get any emails from people before class that said, hey, how do we solve this? Because the answer to that is you have to have exception handling, which we haven't covered yet, and I would have given you information on how to incorporate that into your program or how to code around it, but to my surprise, no one asked, because it didn't seem like anyone thoroughly tested their program, or if they did, you just ignored the fact that your program crashed every time. Need to be really, really careful about that, because in the future, I did not take off points for that in this particular homework assignment because we had not covered it explicitly in class. But that won't be true in the future because it should have been covered in your testing.
I try to use that with repeating keys of.
Now that would be another way that you could handle it.
Okay.
Absolutely. And if you did that and incorporated sy-subrc to test the result, that would have worked just great.
Okay.
That's another, well, yes, that's another way of structuring it, absolutely. Other questions either about anything I just mentioned or anything else that came up maybe in your writing of your homework or as you were reviewing the scoring that you think would be helpful for us to discuss?
I think you get the DB count in the set message.
How do you get it in there?
Yeah, because you said at the bottom, so I assume you were talking about a set message.
No, I just meant you put the table out and then underneath the table you put that there. But you could put SYDB count in a message.
How do you do that? Because on my child it just crashed. It's like it doesn't like that.
Let me see if I have a program that has any database interaction in it that we could play around with. Well, actually, we could do SYDB count, and even if we're not doing a database interaction here. So we could just do, well, and let's see what happens. Message, and then the syntax of the message here is, the first one is, so this could be where the issue comes, DB count type, and we'll just make it an information message. So you say you tried something like this and this doesn't work?
Yeah, but you also want like records displayed part. So it's like adding both parts of it.
Okay. All right, well, let's see if we can get this to work, and then I'll show you how to do that. Although, just to be clear, this wasn't what I was expecting you to do, but it would have been fine for you to do in general as a programming thing. I've noticed our system is running just extremely slow this morning. And I don't know whether it's a network issue or I'm inclined to think it's a server issue. So it doesn't like what I have here. Let's see what it says. If message type is used, message must be compatible. Okay, so it does not like me putting a variable here. So actually what you could do is we could build up a string. So we could do data, message, type, string, and then we could do message equals. I don't know if we can, let's see if we can do string concatenation this way. DB count plus records added, and then do MSG. Let's see if this works for us. If not, I might have to play around with some other techniques to see. Boy, this is going to be frustrating if this is how fast our system's going to run today. I didn't experience this over the weekend, so maybe they're doing maintenance this morning in Milwaukee. All right, I didn't get any kind of error message or anything, but records added cannot be interpreted as a number. Okay, so this is, I would have to use the concatenation function in order to make this work. So let me come up with the exact syntax of that, and we can talk about it next time. So I'll do that. Other any questions of any sort anyone has about anything that would be helpful for us to discuss.
Is there any like default way to deal with the month? Like some of them take 30 days, some of them take 31
Well,
days, some take 28 days.
There are, I'm sure we would find, well, there is a very easy way to handle it that was not available to you given the way I specified this program. And I did it the way I did it just because I wanted you to get used to having to use the data domain to specify a range of values. If the system will ever come back up, I will show you what would be the preferred way to do this.
It seemed like doing our own error checking for dates was like,
It's very tedious.
yeah.
You can do it, and there are some methods out there that will that are part of the ABAP library that'll let you do date checking. But because we haven't gotten into calling function modules yet, we haven't explicitly covered how to do that. Good grief! I don't know what's going on here with our hosting site.
But for this, if we just did an if statement, it's fine.
Well, I didn't expect you to actually even check. I expected you to make sure that it was a valid month, it was between 1 and 31, and it was a year that was representing someone who could be alive today. So, and somebody at one point asked in class about whether or not we had to do date checking, and I said no. So it was fine if people did, and there were 2 or 3 people that checked certain things, and that was great. But that was not actually something that I expected for people to do. But to your broader question about birthday, a much easier way to do it would have been to use a different data type. Because if you do parameters bday type D, yeah, this is going to be very frustrating this morning for us if every time we want to run something. Is it Wi-Fi?
It was slow Friday also.
I didn't bring my hook up to the wired network, unfortunately. So I don't think I activated it. But it's odd. It you know, if it's Wi-Fi, it shouldn't be taking this long on the back end, which it seems like it's doing because I'm getting these running stripe here. But if I use, oh no, that's odd. You've seen this before where we get a calendar lookup when we use type D for date. But I'm not getting that in this particular program. Let me do some investigation about that too. But you can actually pop up a calendar pretty easily for a user.
Yeah, like if I did it like month where it was like MMD, then I could do it, and then but then it couldn't get the month off of the day. You get what I'm saying? I had to like slice it up to get the day off of the month.
Yeah, you would have to do a calculation and
Yeah.
split that up,
And
absolutely.
so then I just made an if statement instead.
All right.
Yeah, I made a domain. There was only 20 days in February.
Yeah, for people who tried to check and see whether dates were valid. So there were a couple of you that did that, and I appreciated your ingenuity. Other questions?
Do you know when we might be getting homework file?
We need to finish objects, so my guess is you may get it on Wednesday. Definitely not today, though. Okay. All right, well, let's jump back into where we left off. And actually, we have a good slide here that summarizes what our discussions have been to this point. We have been talking about defining classes in ABAP, and we talked about the fact that a class is actually broken up into 2 distinct sections. the definition, which is shown here on this slide, and then the implementation, which is not shown on this slide and which we haven't really talked about in detail. And we said that in the definition, we have the ability to have a public section and a private section appearing in this order. Public always goes first, then private. And we said that what happens in the definition is this is where we can declare data types that are local to the program. We can declare constants. We can have data statements, which is what we use to create attributes. And we can have methods defined where the definition in the definition section just shows the interface to the methods, which means that it shows the parameter passing. And we talked about there being 3 types of parameter passing and then one other mechanism. And in ABAP, we explicitly declare the type of parameter passing. If this is data that is being passed to the method, and the method is going to use it in doing its work, then that is an importing parameter. If we are giving data to the method, and on the inbound side, the variable isn't set to anything notable, and we're expecting the method to set it to a value that then we are going to use, that would be an exporting parameter. Changing is the idea that we're going to put data in a data object or variable, pass it to a method, and then that method will change it and pass it back to us. And then the last mechanism is not really parameter passing per se, but it is a mechanism whereby a method gives data back to us, and that is through the returning syntax. And I think we have really all of these illustrated on this particular slide here. We see there are 2 methods created, method 1 and method 2. Method 1 has 2 importing parameters, 1 exporting parameter, and 1 changing parameter. Method 2 has 1 importing and 1 returning. We observed last time that if we are going to use returning, we can only have importing parameters, and so that's illustrated here by method 2. We did indicate that in terms of the parameter passing mechanism, by default, you get pass by reference, which means that, bless you, a copy is not made, and you are actually giving the method access to the original data object such as it exists in your program. If you want to employ pass by value, which means that a copy is made, then you do that by using the keyword value and putting the name of the parameter in parentheses as illustrated here on this line in the example slide. So we're going to do a lot more with this, but at least in terms of where we left off last time, this is where we were. Any questions about any of this? All right, so what's not shown here that I will also remind you of is remember that we can create attributes, make them either public or private, and we talked last time about the fact that in ABAP it is available to us and therefore commonly used for an attribute to be declared to be public but read-only. And that gives us a security mechanism and also an ease of access that isn't necessarily available in other programming languages. So let's turn our attention now to the implementation. The code for what the method actually does is placed in the class implementation. And that's the only thing that goes in the class implementation. So if we go back to our source code that we started last time that had our classes in it, you'll notice that in my class definition we have a types statement that creates a structure. We have another type statement related to miles per gallon. We have a data statement that creates a driver attribute. Looks like that's our only actual attribute at this point. And then we have where we have created certain methods, we commented them out as we went along so as to do a syntax check. All of that is part of the vehicle definition. The only thing that goes into the vehicle implementation section is the code that indicates what each method does. And the syntax that we employ in that section is we have the keyword method and then the name of the method and then a period after that statement, and then we put the code there, and then eventually we have an end method statement. Now, if we compare this to the previous slide, you'll see that on the previous slide it said that var1 and var2 were importing, var3 is exporting, and var4 is changing. So in method 1, we would see that particular behavior. The key thing to keep in mind is I do not repeat the interface here in implementation. The interface is up in the definition. So all I'm going to do down here is actually start writing my code. Another common mistake I see people make is they put a data statement here and they start declaring var1 and var2 and things like that. We don't do that. Now, if you need a variable that is just local to this particular method. Maybe you're going to do some math and you want to store that math in an intermediate data object to use for something in the context of this method. You can have a data statement here and create a local variable. But we don't do that for the attributes. The attributes already exist and they will be set appropriately to values in the context of our program. So, let's come back to the program that we were working on when we were last together, and let's start writing some methods. I'm going to do this. I'm going to comment this one out, just for the sake of we'll attack these one at a time, and so uncomment them as we're ready. And one of the things that comes in really handy that we have not had cause to use so far this semester, that's a facet of the interface, is the split screen right here. Right here above the scroll bar, there's this little rectangle that if I put my cursor on it very carefully and drag down will let me split the screen. So what I'm going to do is we're going to work on the say hi method here. So I'm going to uncomment out these two lines of code so that we can work on them. And I chose uncomment out, and it's while we're back to it being slow again. Let's try this again. Format, uncomment selection. All right, well, we're going to uncomment it ourselves. All right, so now I go down here into my implementation section, and I'm ready to define what say hi does. Notice say hi is really easy. There's no parameter passing here at all. So I do method say hi, and then all this is going to do is going to write to the screen at the beginning of a new line, hi, and then end method. And so now we have our method interface defined, we have our method definition defined, and life is good in terms of the say hi method. All right, well, that was pretty trivial. Let's take on one with a little bit more complexity here. Set MPG, which is going to be taking in new MPG of type P. All right, so this hard to see with my split screen here. Actually, no, it's not. Right here on line 44, we see that we do have an attribute called MPG. So let's write our definition for our set MPG method. So method set MPG, and this is just going to be an assignment statement. MPG, which is my attribute, should be set to new MPG. The end. Okay? The key is, as I just mentioned, I don't have to do any kind of declaration or anything related to MPG because that happened on line 44 when that was defined as one of our attributes. And I don't have to do anything with new MPG because that was defined as being a parameter on line 23. Now I want to call something to your attention here that I didn't have to do in this instance. Notice, first of all, there's no default value here. If there were a default value specified, default 18, well, then this code would work just fine. And if the user called set MPG and did not pass it a miles per gallon, it will result in MPG being set to 18. But suppose new MPG were declared to be optional. Would make sense in this context. But if I have an attribute that is, if I have a parameter that is declared to be optional, I'm going to have to account for the possibility of it not being set if it's an importing parameter. And I'll show you how to do that in later code. But both of these methods are about as simple as we can get, and actually not all that uncommon to see, particularly for a setter to look like what you're seeing here on lines 53 through 55. Any questions about this? All right, well, let's keep going and see what other methods we created last time that need to be defined. Next up in sequence is an example of what we talked about just a moment ago, which is having optional parameters. So here's where I have to start making some design decisions. Set driver info is going to set information about a new driver. Now I know that I want to take the new name of the new driver. But here's the question. Suppose I am not given a new age. What do you think I should do?
So a message statement or the default?
Set it to the previous old age.
Okay, I could leave the age as it was set from the previous driver. I don't know. Does that make sense? I mean, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't.
Depends on the context of the program, too. If it's like a yearly update, then you can just add one to the age if they leave one out.
I could do that, but keep in mind the whole idea here is I'm changing this to a different driver. It seems weird to make an assumption like that. But my point is, we have to think about this from a design decision. And in some contexts, you might say, well, we just leave the old age in place. In some cases, you might say, well, we'll set age to 0 if they don't give us a new age. Either of those could be perfectly valid design decisions. It's up to you to intuit that from the context. Notice here, New Year's driving has a default value. So I don't have to worry about that. The only thing that I really have to pay a little bit more attention to is that new age. And so let's talk about, let's start writing the code and talk about how we would do this. So here I have method set driver info, and I always like to go ahead and put in the end method statement just so I forget. And like we did in the set MPG, we're just doing some assignments here, although our assignments get a little bit more complicated because the name of my attribute is driver. Okay, so I'm going to have driver dash name equals new name. That's pretty straightforward. That's kind of the most common scenario there, where new name, of course, is the parameter that I'm being passed. Driver is my attribute, and it's a structure, so driver-name sets that particular field. And then, I'm getting a little bit out of order here, but we also would have driver dash, and I think we called it years driving, equals new years driving. So those are really straightforward. The question becomes, what do I do about new age? How do I handle this? And here's the rule of thumb. I need to, as I am writing this method, discern, was I passed a value or not? And here's how I make that test. If new age is initial, that means new age was not set to a value. Okay? I could do something like this. If new age is initial, then I make a decision that I'm going to set the age to 0. Okay? If new age is initial, then driver-age equals 0. Else, driver-age equals new age. End if. But the key is, anytime I have an optional parameter, you're going to expect to see code like this, where my method uses this mechanism to find out, was this parameter set to a value or not? And if it was not, what are we going to do about it? Now, if you said, well, if it's not set to a new age, then I'm just going to use the old age. Well, then you could do something. You could switch your logic around a little bit here and do, if new age is not initial, driver age equals new age. And there would not be an else, because the implication is, if it wasn't set to a value, then you just leave the old one in place. So you could see either of those two scenarios being common there. Any questions about this? All right, well, let's do a syntax check real quick here and make sure I haven't mistyped anything, and looks like we're good. All right, so we're moving up the scale here in complexity. Now I have swap driver, and then I have exporting. Okay? Now there's actually a couple different ways I could do this. I'm going to do it the more verbose way. So method swap driver, end method, and let's uncomment these lines. Let's see if there we go, work this time. All right, so got to be careful about the order in which I do these, because I don't want to set the new driver before I pull the information on the old driver out. And so I just noticed a typo. This should probably be old driver. And so what I want to have here is old driver equal driver-name, and old age equal driver-age, and then old years driving equal driver-years driving. So now I've actually taken care of the exporting part of this first, and then I'm going to see code exactly like I have up here. So at least for the moment, until we talk about other ways of doing this, I'm just going to drag this right here and copy it right here. And so now we have the code in place for the swapping of the driver. And is that all the methods we've done so far? Oh, here we have, all right, so now here's a different one we have. This is swap driver 2, which this time doesn't rely on importing and exporting, it relies on changing. So let's look at this scenario, and I think I've discovered it doesn't like to uncomment out the stars. So
It's because you didn't have the star from in front of method highlighted, I think.
is that what it was? Okay. Okay. All right. So method swap driver to end method. Now this gets a little bit tricky here because I can't put the old one into the parameters, because if I do, I lose what's in there as far as my new information. So I am going to have to create a local data object. And so I'm going to just do this data new driver type, and I created a data type associated with this structure. What's the name of that data type? Driver struct. This is going to be really long code, but not really necessarily complex here. So now I'm going to do new driver dash name equals name, new driver dash age equals age, new driver dash years driving equals years driving. And then I'm going to do name equals driver dash name, age equals driver dash age, years driving equal driver dash years driving. And then finally, and then I've got to go back and check something here, driver dash name equals new driver dash name, driver dash age equals new driver dash age, and then driver years driving equals new dash years driving. Now, anybody remember there is a shorter way of doing this right here? We talked about how you can copy from one structure to another. Anybody remember the syntax of that?
Move to or something?
What's that?
Isn't it like move to or something?
I think it is. Yeah, I think there's a move statement where you could have done move target to destination. And so that would have been an alternative. Although in this case, since we're just doing 3 lines, it's not really that problematic. But now, everything I've written here is presumably correct. Let's do a syntax check to make sure it's syntactically valid. And we're fine there. But I didn't handle age being optional. So in this scenario right here, new driver age equals age. All right, so that is setting the incoming parameter to, or setting new driver's age to what the incoming parameter is. I might want to, like we did up here, employ some, or actually up here, employ some conditional code around age. And so we could come back here and say, when we go to set the age to that of the new driver, we could do if driver dash age is initial, then I'm looking for my home button, age equals zero. Else driver or else age equals driver dash age. I think I've got that right. It's early in the morning. Keeping all this straight. End if. All right, let's do a syntax check here. And we're good. So we have illustrated here everything except we don't have a method that uses returning, and for the sake of time we won't add one that does at this point, but at some point we'll come back in our code here and add a returning mechanism here. Any questions so far? Okay, so I didn't have to employ it this time, but we may at some point in the future. Within a method, reference to an object's attributes or other methods is generally unambiguous. But if we ever have an ambiguity, for example, if we have a parameter that has the same name as the attribute, so I have a parameter named age, and I have an attribute named age. So in my method, I use the data object age. Am I referring to the parameter, or am I referring to the attribute? And the way I disambiguate this is with the keyword me. And so my code would look something like this. I have me and then the arrowhead, which is a dash and a greater than symbol, and then the name of the attribute. So we could do me, arrowhead, age equals age. And in this instance, on the right side of the equal sign, this right here, this is the parameter, and this right here, this is the attribute. And I know that because of the use of me. Some programming languages, I think, use my. Some programming languages use this. But ABAP uses what sounds really weird to talk about me attribute as opposed to my attribute, but that's the way they've written that. So if we look back at our code, do we have any instances of that in any of our methods where we have attributes and we really don't, because we've embedded the driver inside of a structure. And the name of my attribute is actually, where'd he go? It's all the way at the top, driver. So I don't really see anything here that I have to disambiguate in my code, but we will certainly see that in other examples that we work through. Well, there's one thing that we would really like to be able to do here to know whether this works, and that's test this out. So how do we actually create an object and use it? Well, objects are created in ABAP. It's a multi-step process. The first thing, we're going to see something new in our ABAP programming that we have not seen in other programs before, and that is the set of keywords start of selection. And when I put start of selection in my code, that essentially tells ABAP this is where you actually start running from. So in this example right here, lines 1 through 97 are just defining a class, but there's no executable code there. So ABAP's going to look through this and look for a start of selection statement and say, oh, okay, I actually start running on line 98 in this instance. So I have to have that in my object-oriented programming. And then to create an object, I have a data statement where I give my object a name, and then you'll see type ref2 and then the name of the class. And all that does is create the data object. To actually instantiate the object, I use the keyword sequence create object and then list the name of the object. So let's go back to our code here, start of selection, data, and I'll call this my driver, type ref2, and what was the name of the overall class here? Oh, actually, it's not really a driver. Vehicle is what I should be calling this. So my vehicle type ref2 vehicle, and then create object my vehicle. So at this point now, when this code is run, I am going to be instantiating the vehicle class. Now, how do I actually start calling methods and start doing this? And this is another place where ABAP gets a little bit weird. But before we forge ahead, any questions so far? I mean, stop me if at any point you have a question pop up. So how do I call a method? One option is what you see here. The name of the object, an arrowhead, the name of the method, open parentheses, space, closing parentheses. And there cannot be a space before the opening parentheses. There must be one afterwards. So I could do my vehicle arrowhead, say hi, like so. And we should find that invokes the say hi method. And so object activated, run, and there we go. In fact, that did call the say hi method and resulted in my being printed out on the screen. But that is the easiest scenario. If we have a method that only has one importing parameter, just one. Do we have a method like that in this program? Let's see. Do we have a method that has one importing parameter? Yeah, we have set MPG that falls into that category, but that's it. Everything else is more complex, okay? So let's read the rules here for how we would call the set MPG method. So let me go down here. So that's what set MPG looks like. If I have that scenario, then I can do this. I can have, once again, the name of the object, the arrowhead, the name of the method, opening parentheses, space, and then what I want the payload to be. And because this is actually importing, I trust you understand that I could therefore do this. I could do my vehicle set MPG 14. So that's a literal number I'm coding in there. There's no problem with that because it's an importing parameter. I could have a data object sitting there just as an alternative as well. There'd be no problem there. The only issue here is that didn't result in any output being put to the screen, so you don't really know whether or not that actually worked. We could employ the debugger to check, but just for the sake of time at this point, we won't actually do that. So, no parameters, I can do what you see on line 101. One importing parameter, I can do what you see on line 102. Then the world changes rather significantly. If I have several importing parameters, then I have to list the parameters in pairs where formal parameter equals actual parameter, which sounds more complicated than it actually is. But we see this. Okay, so let's look and see if we have an example of a method that has several importing parameters, and we do. We have set driver info. Okay, so here's what I'm telling you. Here's how we do this. My vehicle arrowhead set driver info. And then what I do, you notice my name and my parameters are new name, new age, New Year's driving. So I could do this. New name equals Bob. New age equals 44. New year's driving equals 20. And I'm going to pull some of this down to the next line just because it's gotten a little wide on the screen. And then like so. So this is a little bit different. When I only have importing parameters, but I have multiple importing parameters, what I have to do is list on the left side of an equal sign the name of the parameter, and on the right side what I want the value to be. Now in this particular example, everything on the right side of the equal sign is a literal value. No problem there. I can do that. But those could just as easily be variable names. I could have asked the user to supply a name, and it's stored in a variable called nm. So that might say new name equals nm, and new age equals nage, and New Year's driving equals nyd, or something of that sort. But the rule of thumb is multiple importing parameters. I list the name of the parameter and the value on the right. Now, if you think about this, this is how I can have parameters be optional. Because I'm not going to edit it for the sake of time, but lines 103 and 104 could say set driver info, new name equals Bob, and that'd be it. Because I'm electing not to set new age because it's optional, and I'm electing not to set New Year's driving because it's optional too with the default value specified. Alternately, inside of the parentheses I could have new name equals Bob, New Year's driving equals 25, and not have specified a new age because it's optional. So the reason why I have to be this explicit, if you will, is because of ABAP's need to know which parameters you're setting and which ones you're leaving empty because of its support for optional parameters. Any questions about this? Okay, well, so we've talked about no parameters. We've talked about one importing parameter. We've talked about multiple importing parameters. Suppose you have parameters of types other than importing. Well, now it gets even more verbose. And what I have to do is this. Object, arrowhead, name of method, and then exporting, and then my parameters, settings, like we did up here, and then importing, and then my parameter setting, and then changing, and then my parameter setting. Now, here's where this gets potentially confusing, and so I want to make sure we understand it. Okay, here's my method, and my method says I'm importing A and B, I'm exporting C and D, and I'm changing E. Okay? So it's thinking of this in terms of itself. Over here is my caller. Okay? From the caller's perspective, the stuff that it's sending over here, it's exporting this. And the stuff that the method is sending back, it's importing. So in the call versus the method interface, exporting and importing swap. So exporting on the caller matches up with importing. Importing on the caller matches up with exporting from the method's perspective. And the good thing is changing on both ends. So that gets potentially a little bit tricky, but the nice thing is it's extremely explicit, and so of course the system can do checking here. So let's look at the one example we have of this, which is swap driver. Okay, now the whole idea behind this is I'm going to be sending this method information about a driver. So let's do this. Data driv name type, and I think we probably made this as a string, value Roberta, data driv age, type I, value 18, data driv, let's just do YD, type I, value 1. All right, so I have now created a set of values that I can use to call swap driver. And so here's what I could do. My vehicle, and the name of the method is swap driver. And here's what I like to do. Before I start putting in values, I'm going to do this. I know that on this end, exporting matches up with importing. So I know I've got to say exporting new name equals, and then something's got to go here. And then new age equals, and then something's got to go here. And I'm going to go down to a new line here just because I'm out of space. And then new year's driving is going to be set to something. And that takes care of the importing parameters on the part of swap driver. Then I'm going to have importing, and here old driver equals something, old age equals something, and then new line old years driving equals something. And that's going to be it. And a lot of times I will do exactly what I have done here as I'm getting started. And I'll look at my interface of my method, and I'll come down here and I'll say, okay, importing matches with exporting, and so new name, new age, new year's driving. And then exporting matches with importing, old driver, old age, old year's driving. And I'll set it up like this, like I did here with the X's, and then I come back and say, okay, now let's make this actually work the way we want to. And what I want to have happen is I want Roberta to be made the new driver in place of Bob, who was set up in line 103 and 104. So the new name here is currently stored in driv name. And the new age is currently stored in driv age. And the new year's driving is currently stored in driv YD. So that looks pretty good. So now the question is, where do I want the information from the old driver to go? And I want the old driver to be put into, and so now here's the question, where am I going to do that? And I'll just, I could do this by creating another data object, or I could reuse the data objects that I did for Roberta. But just for the sake of this example, to keep this really clean, I'm going to do data old driver type string, data old age type I, data old YD type I. And so now I want the old driver parameter set to old driver, and I want old age set to the data object old age, and I want the old year's driving set to be equal to old YD. Now let me syntax check that, and then we'll talk through this. And it doesn't like something that I've done, so let's see what that is. Formal parameter old driver does not exist. However, the parameter old driver, so that's on line 114. And I love this. I mean, that's a pretty good error message as far as error messages go. I'm going to get rid of my little split screen here. And on line 14, the formal parameter old, yeah, this says old river, but that should say old driver. So let's save that change and do another syntax check. And I apparently do it again.
Correct the cursor.
Didn't I just change that?
You changed on the other side of the
You
equal
misspelled
sign.
both of them the exact.
Oh, I misspelled both of them. Is it old? Is this supposed to be old driver is correct? Okay. So, and actually the second one is what I just fixed is what it flagged as the error. It wouldn't have flagged the other one. Now, what's really important to understand here, and the reason why this line of code, even though it looks weird, makes perfect sense. The left side of the equal sign is always the parameter name, and the right side is the value. So this is saying set the parameter new name equal to driv name, and set the parameter new age equal to driv age, set parameter New Year's driver equal to driv yid, and set the parameter old driver to be old driver, set the parameter named old age to the data object old age, and set the parameter old years driving equal to old YD. Okay? Kind of weird looking, perhaps, as compared to other programming languages, but you got to admit, once you get the hang of it, it's really explicit what's going on here. You know exactly what parameter matches up with what value, you know what direction the parameter passing is happening, and so life is pretty good here. What we don't have in this is any kind of diagnostic code to indicate to ourselves that this is actually working. So let's look at that for a second. If I look at the attribute in my class that I made public, I made driver public read only. So I can reference it down here. So right after I set Bob to be the driver, I could do this, write driver equal, and this is driver, and the name of the attribute is name, and age, driver age, and year driving. All right, so, and I got a error here, probably misspelled something again. Field driver is unknown. Isn't that? Oh. Why is this not good? Because this should actually say my vehicle, which is the name of the object, and then the name of the attribute is driver, and then name is what? That's a field in a structure, so it should look like that, should it not? Is that how we disambiguate this? So got to keep our symbols straight here, and I've got to spell my vehicle right. Okay, yep, that too. My vehicle, arrowhead, so I got to go up here. Driver. All right, that looks better. And then, all right, so what we're doing here is my vehicle is a reference to the object. Driver is a reference to the attribute. Years driving is a field in the attribute. So I think I fixed that now. Let's do a syntax check. I did. So what we should see is we should see hi, and then we should see coming from the object itself, here's Bob, 44 and 20. Now, formatting here is horrible. I'd want to fix that and get those to line up real pretty. So let's go ahead and do that just to be a good example here. We'll put all of these over at column 20. And then what I could do is after I change this to Roberta, let's call this again so that, whoops, get that slash out of there, because we want to see Roberta's information. And then we didn't really actually put a new driver in here. So let's do that with some default values here. Value Kevin, and Kevin's age is 99, and value for years driving will be 55. And then one last time we will print out information on the driver. So we should now actually see that this particular class has gone through 3 different drivers. Hey, look at that. I didn't make a typo that time. And so there we go. Bob has been age of 44, driving for 20 years. Bob again, 44 and 20, and then Roberta, 18 and 1. Is that what we expected? To see Bob show up twice?
You never assigned it back. That was just declaring it in structure.
So then Roberta, Kevin, right?
Yeah, but here's Roberta. Oh, did I never assign Roberta? Did I never call the method and set her? I didn't do that, did I? That seems weird. So let's do that real quick, because that was intended to happen right here. This was going to be my vehicle. And was it set driver? I thought for sure we did this at some point. Oh, we did right here with Bob. I don't know. We're about out of time, so I'm not going to do this right here. But you see where we are getting the results after we have swapped in Roberta. I created Kevin, but we never actually put him into the object. So we have now, and this slide, whoops, right here, summarizes the parameter passing. We haven't talked about returning yet. We'll do that. But this is another place where you can shoot yourself in the foot. In the method definition, if I use importing, exporting, changing, and returning, then when I call the method, importing matches with exporting, exporting matches with importing, changing's the same, and what I declare in the method definition as returning on the method call is denoted as receiving. So you kind of have to keep all of that straight in your brain, or just work through it and remember the inverse here. Questions about this? So there are a couple more things that we'll talk about on Wednesday, and we'll work through an example together, and then I should be able to give you your next homework assignment on Wednesday, which will involve you creating a class or two and then actually using some objects in your program. A couple minutes left, last minute questions before we head out. All right, if you did not sign in, please make sure you come do that before you head out. Have a good rest of the day, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday.
I did have all the